All keen mountain bikers will no doubt have a preferred mechanic or two who looks after their trusty steed by way of regular services, tweaks and tune-ups with professional skill. However, there is one aspect of a bike, or in the case of a dual suspension bike, two, that requires specific attention. Suspension service is something of a specialised art, and in South Africa there are a number of skilled practitioners who devote their workshops to repairing, servicing and restoring suspension setups. Among them is a man often referred to as the suspension guru, Robbie Powell.
Well, yeah, it's a long story. It started in 1988 and I've been in the industry ever since. Had various hats on during that time, but suspension has always been my passion. Yeah, so here we are, 30 odd years later.
So what exactly is the concept behind Robbie's bicycle concepts?
So for me, it's very important that people understand the whole bicycle. So the concept behind my business is the concept of actually bringing the bike together as a whole. So I see a lot of guys, and I've been involved in stage racing for a long time. I see a lot of guys spend a lot of money on cassettes and chains and chain rings and tires and training and nutrition, but they forget the most important part of their bicycle is their suspension. A lot of people neglect that part, and I think that as a whole the bicycle needs to be looked at as a complete tool and need to be addressed as such. So I think for us that's where our business came from, developing a concept of allowing the riders to better use their suspension, better understand their suspension, and which is why if you look at our YouTube channel you'll see that there's quite a lot of information there regarding how to set up your bike and all that kind of stuff.
In his early days, Robbie was a South African downhill champion and represented South Africa at the World Championships.
That was a crazy time, right in the start of the sport. My first downhill World Champs was in '92. I was very fortunate to be involved with a lot of really great riders. John Tomac and Baz de Beaver were guys that I was riding with at that time, also sponsored by Manitou. So yeah, and of course all the South African legends. Greg Minnaar is one of them, but I mean, yeah, as I say, just crazy time.
So just why did Robbie decide to focus his energies on suspension?
I've always had a passion for suspension. Before I was doing bicycles, I was riding motorbikes. So in that time, we were also tinkering with suspension. So when it came to the bicycles, my first bicycle was actually a completely rigid bike. And when I got my first suspension bike, it changed my life completely. And it started out with front suspension. In fact, my first front suspension bike was a Cannondale M700, which I rode the '92 World Champs with. And I was one of the few guys that actually had any suspension. So that was quite a thing for me. So yeah, and as it's developed, I mean, it's actually been fantastic. If you look around here, you'll see I've kept quite a lot of the frames from all the early years, and the development of the suspension, the kinematics has been absolutely fantastic. So it's been a privilege to be a part of that development. And for me, it's very exciting to be in an industry that's constantly developing, that we're moving that edge of technology further and further all the time.
RBC are very client focused. They try and maintain a 48-hour turnaround time regardless of where the suspension unit is sent from. And there are also regulars in the workshop compound at most of the big stage races like the FMB Wines to Wales and, of course, the Absa Cape Epic.
We sponsor a few guys, but our main thrust at the Epic is to actually look after all the riders. A lot of the guys don't understand the elements that they're facing when they come to the Epic. My biggest thing there is actually preparation. A lot of the guys come without having their suspension serviced. So by day 3, they're already feeling the arms are tired, they're getting sore muscles, and it's all from the fact that the suspension stopped working. From a familiar face point of view, I look after a lot of the SRAM guys. So Matt Beers, I was doing his stuff last year, and obviously Nino Schurter, I've done his suspension as well. But yeah, everyone is equal. We look after everybody there, and I'm happy to give any advice or assistance while I'm there, you know. Just to give you an idea, I mean, a lot of guys, I think when they buy their bike, it's a package. So they don't look at the suspension as actually part of that a part of their working parts. They assume it's just part of the frame and it's just going to work as it is. But to give you an idea, when we run our telemetry on a 20-kilometer circuit, on average a fork is doing 44,000 movements. So in other words, up and down movements. That's a lot over a 20-kilometer period. So that is working really hard. It's actually the hardest, the front fork and the rear shock are the hardest working parts of the bike. It's great to have a light bike and to have all the cool components, but without doing anything to your suspension, it's actually not going to help you at all. I really believe in sharing because, I mean, this industry is built on sharing. So I'm fortunate to have a great group of guys that we work with. Really nice, all very knowledgeable in what they do. For me, it's important that I'm able to transfer some of my knowledge to anybody who's interested. So I get guys coming from all over to do training here. I've actually got some guys coming from Mauritius now in the new year. But yeah, most stores in South Africa send their guys just for a little bit of training. Obviously, for me, the most important part of the training is understanding. There's a lot of stuff that they can't do because they don't have the equipment, but as long as they can understand what they're dealing with, half of the job is already done.
So what are some of the most common suspension problems his team of mechanics have to deal with regularly?
Well, the sag is critical. A lot of guys will look at what the recommendations are from the manufacturer. For me, I prefer to deal with a sag because a sag is much more accurate because our body types are all different. So when you're sitting on the bike, your posture, the way your stem is, the handlebar, your seat position, everything has an effect on the sag. So by using the manufacturer's recommendations, it's really just a guideline. Setting up your sag is crucial. So we actually send out all the suspension we service. It's got little details on the suspension and exactly how much sag you should set on the type of riding you're looking for. On that is also a little QR code which will take you to our setup video, because I believe, as I say, the suspension setup is critical to how the suspension performs. The magnesium lowers, you're looking at quite a lot of technology that goes into that, just from a design perspective. Obviously, magnesium is quite a difficult material to work from, so they have to, it's a semi-molten state. They've got it injected into the mold at 690 tons. So there's not many places in the world that can do that. So that is the start. Then obviously you have the stanchions. The stanchions are designed with taper, so they also have a certain flex quantity or quality about them. Then of course the crown and the steerer tube, and the most important part is of course the damper. But a lot of people also don't understand how the air spring works. So if you're running an air spring, understanding where you fit on the bell curve of that manufacturer's design intention is important on how you set up your air spring.
RBC is a small but loyal team of staff who keep clients smiling with their expertise. With his vast knowledge and experience in all aspects of the sport, how does Robbie Powell see the sport and the bikes evolving in the future?
I think cross-country 120, I'm told that it's just a matter of time before there's a 130 fork out there for cross-country. XCO is quite rough compared to what it used to be. I think the guys need that extra suspension. So yeah, I spoke earlier about how we're always on the edge of the technology. So we're developing this all the time. So definitely, I think in the next year or so, you'll see a 130 XC fork. Kind of 100, 120 for XC, even 100 is like a little bit too little now. And trail, obviously, 130 to 150, and then enduro 160 and upwards. So yeah, lots of names branded around like down country, XCO, trail, enduro, downhill, and free ride, and you can get mixed up in everything. But essentially, whatever you buy needs to be set up correctly. The majority of suspension, if you've got a damper, it comes out with a rebound. Should have a rebound adjuster. You should have a high-speed compression and a low-speed compression. On some forks, the high-speed compression set is a 3 or 2-stage lockout, which can be manual or remote. Your low speed is adjustable separate to that, and it normally only works in the open mode. Obviously your rebound is adjustable at the bottom. You set your rebound according to your sag. Once you've set that, you're ready to go. In the old days, the rebound used to only have one shim. So you would typically change the rebound settings if you were doing dirt jumping or bigger hits. Nowadays you have a speed sensitive rebound shim stack, which kind of, once you set up your low speed, it will work with the high speed as well. The sag setting is the key. The suspension is actually the air spring or the coil spring. It's not the damper. The damper controls the energy that's coming back or going into the system. Setting up the air or the spring, the coil sag, is the most important factor. If you've got that right, it's easy enough to set up the damper. There's a crop of really interesting XCO bikes coming onto the market. Some of them have shorter travel, some of them have longer travel. You get rising rate and falling rate suspension systems. But essentially what you want to be able to do is make sure that the back and the front are working together. And the same applies on the front as the back. If you get the sag setting right and you got your rebound set correctly, you're 100% ready to go. Being involved in so many minds trying to create the ultimate kinematics, the suspension design. So if you look at the frames around us, there's a lot of different designs and they all have different attributes and aspects of how they initiate the suspension travel, how it goes through the stroke, exactly how it affects, how it's affected by the pedaling, how it affects the actual bike itself. So yeah, I think whatever brand that you're buying, if it's a well-known brand, the suspension kinematics is going to be set up really nicely. The important aspect is that the majority of them work really well as long as you set up your suspension correctly. All my experience from riding around the world and actually being involved with some of the suspension designs and also bringing it to market, it's been interesting to see how the Western Cape's environment affects all the suspension designs that the guys bring. And I'm not talking about really the kinematics of the frames, I'm actually talking about the suspension units themselves. So for instance, take the Epic. It's a good example of a really hard ride. So you'll be cruising along, temperature's 40 degrees, the white road or single track is reflecting that heat into the fork. It's adding probably an extra 10 degrees. Add to that the energy that's coming out of your damper is also increasing the heat. And then the dust, the grit that you get there gets in everywhere. It has a huge effect, and I think a lot of people don't understand how suspension works. So you've got your bushings, upper and lower bushings in a front fork, and you've got a stanchion. The two are not supposed to touch each other. They're supposed to have a film of oil between them. Because the oil is not compressible, it actually reduces the friction between the two because they're essentially not touching. As the oil circulates through the fork, as the fork moves up and down, that oil comes out the top on the stanchions, the dust sits on that and it takes that off. So essentially, when you start the Epic with either your 5 mils and your RockShox or your 30 mils and your Fox, by day 3, you pretty much need a new service because that oil is gone. That's the kind of feedback a lot of these international companies are looking for. One of the companies that we work with is DT. They send us suspension, we use it down here. Before it's released, we send it back. They analyze how 6 months of non-servicing and riding stage races in the Western Cape has affected their suspension before they put it onto the market. So that tells us that that's what a key element of their design is, to make sure that it can handle that kind of riding. A lot of people don't understand the actual suspension design. So before we talk about price, let's talk about exactly what's going on inside there. So as a human, we're quite low on the power scale. So to actually maximize that energy that we're putting into our bikes, we need to eliminate a number of factors like your pedal bob, how much energy you can produce, your weight. Also, you need to be able to change the circuitry. So for instance, from open to closed, the oil changes the direction of where it's flowing into different parts of the shim stack. So in understanding that, and if you look at the weight that the suspension is, it's actually a very highly developed product that the guys are dealing with. So obviously price is going to reflect what you're buying. Essentially, if you get any of the well-known name brands, the RockShox, the Fox, the DTs, the the X-Fusions, the Olins, all of those are going to give you a fantastic product. It just depends on the price point you want and also what you want out of it. The more you spend, the more you're going to get out of it. So, okay, from a price perspective, front forks, I would say I would look at least minimum 5 to 10,000 Rand for an entry-level fork, going up to 30 grand for a really good high-end trail or enduro or downhill fork. A rear shock, about the same, 5 to 10 grand, 5 to 8 really for an entry level, and then going up to 25, 30 grand for a coil or a really nice enduro or downhill rear shock.
Hope you enjoyed the program. That's all from this week's edition of Toyota Cadence.